Late summer 1944. The front lines across Western Europe were already stacked with steel, Panthers and Tigers prowling the hedgerows, Allied Shermans trying to find angles. Then, almost overnight, a new kind of shell began to arrive in tiny numbers, a tungsten-cored, high-velocity projectile that turned angle and armor calculus on its head. Men who had fought at Kursk in Sicily whispered a new nickname into the mud, the witch's shot. This is the documented, unromantic story of how scarce material science and a precise design changed the balance in armored fights, not by magic, but by velocity, density, and logistics. By 1943-44, Allied tankers had learned the hard lesson of German heavy armor. The Panther and Tiger were not invulnerable myths, they were engineering responses to earlier clashes, but their frontal armor and ranges often forced Shermans to fight for weak side shots and ambushes. The U.S. response had two tracks, better gunnery and better ammunition. The 76mm gun, the M1 family, was introduced to give Sherman variants extra muzzle velocity and flatter trajectories, but even that gun needed a special projectile to close the gap on Panther frontal plates. That projectile would come as a composite rigid round with a tungsten core, high density, extremely hard, designed to concentrate kinetic energy on a small area and punch through rolled homogeneous armor. The answer arrived in the form American Ordnance man called HVAP, High Velocity Armor Piercing, APCR in British terms, and the U.S. T4/M93 HVAP round became available in small shipments from late summer 1944. The design was straightforward, a dense tungsten carbide penetrator seated inside a lightweight alloy carrier so the same gun and handling could be used. At impact, the carrier shed or deformed, and the hard core carried the energy through armor. The muzzle velocity for M93 type HVAP was in the order of 1,030 to 1,040 meters per second, about 3,400 feet per second, which dramatically increased penetration at combat ranges compared with the older APCBC and AP rounds. But supplies were tiny. Tungsten was scarce worldwide. Tank destroyer units and TD crews often got priority for the scarce rounds. That shortage shaped where and when HVAP mattered.
On the battlefield, the effect was terrifying, but not supernatural. When a tungsten-cored HVAP slug hit, it delivered far higher concentrated kinetic energy and a much higher sectional density than standard AP, so it could punch straight through mantlets or turret faces previously considered safe at typical combat distances. Reports from late 1944 note Shermans with M93 rounds achieving penetrations that changed tactical calculus. Frontal engagements became possible at closer ranges rather than constant flanking. Yet frontline accounts were mixed. HVAP worked spectacularly when available and aimed, but it wasn't a neat milk-through miracle. The core's penetration is mechanical. There is no sustained melting of armor. The psychological shock, German crews seeing rare rounds penetrate previously safe arcs, amplified the effect. The limitation was quantity. A Sherman might receive only a handful of HVAP rounds during late war months. Development of the T4M93 HVAP was an engineering sprint across ordnance labs and wartime manufacturers. By mid-1944, prototypes had proven the idea. A dense tungsten carbide core inside a light aluminum carrier produced a projectile with far higher sectional density and muzzle velocity than standard APCBC rounds.
Production began to trickle into the European theater in late summer, early autumn 1944. But the physics that made HVAP lethal also made it expensive and dependent on a strategic metal, tungsten. The U.S. could manufacture cores, but global tungsten supplies were constrained by geography and German access to ore before the war. By 1944, availability dictated distribution and use.
Field commanders quickly discovered that HVAP's advantage would be decided by who got the rounds. Ordnance doctrine and supply practice funneled scarce HVAP to units expected to meet heavy armor. Tank destroyer battalions and frontline TDs were prioritized over ordinary Sherman crews. Contemporary supply notes and unit logs show individual Sherman tanks often carried only a handful of HVAP rounds, sometimes as few as 3 to 5 per vehicle during late war months, while TDs might be allocated several times that. That reality shaped tactics. When HVAP was present, crews conserved it for the best shot. When absent, they reverted to maneuver and combined arms.
Ballistics tables from tests and combat reports explain the effect. The HVAP's muzzle velocity, roughly 1,030 to 1,040 meters per second, about 3,400 feet per second, and the hard tungsten core produced penetration figures far above the standard APC-BC at combat ranges. Where earlier rounds might be stopped by glacis plates or mantlets, HVAP showed the capability to defeat thicker faces at combat distances previously considered unsafe. For example, widely cited penetration estimates place the M93 HVAP penetration at roughly 150 to 240 millimeters, depending on range, angle. Figures that allowed frontal or near-frontal kills against some German targets that had been invulnerable to older U.S. ammunition. That translated into confidence. A gunner now had a theoretical hit that could disable a Panther's mantlet or a Tiger's hull in ranges that had been excluded before.
HVAP's arrival did not happen in a vacuum. Late 1944 operations, the drive across France, the Lorraine battles, and the Bulge counterattacks created moments where the round could matter. Field records indicate the rounds were scarce during the Battle of the Bulge itself. Many historians place wider issue only after September 1944. Where HVAP was present, unit after unit reported altered tactics. TD units would hold the line and let Shermans maneuver for shots, or commanders would mass HVAP for predicted counterattack corridors. In short, HVAP changed options rather than offering a magic bullet. It bought a small number of decisive engagements when properly employed. Germany was not unfamiliar with APCR concepts. Engineers and ordnance services had fielded tungsten-cored AP projectiles earlier, but their program suffered critical resource shortfalls. By 1943-44, Allied interdiction and constrained access to ore reduced German tungsten availability, limiting APCR production and distribution. That scarcity, combined with Allied air dominance disrupting logistics, meant German crews could not fully exploit similar technology even when they developed it. This asymmetry in raw materials turned into asymmetric tactical consequences. Allied HVAP might arrive just in time and in small packets. German APCR was often absent where it was needed most.
Stories spread quickly at the front. A knocked-out Panther with a neat, unexplained penetration. Crews refusing orders after watching a mate's tank vaporize from a single shot. Such tales had emotional truth but required context. Veterans' memoirs and interrogation reports show a mixture of precise, verifiable incidents and oral myth-making. Some accounts misremembered timing or overstayed effects. For instance, literal melting is a mischaracterization of kinetic penetration, while others accurately describe rare but spectacular penetrations that produced panic. For a historian, the job is teasing the two apart, keep the credible eyewitnesses, discard the physics-defying phrases, and map each claim to available documentation.
Despite scarcity, there are documented actions where HVAP tipped a local fight. A tank destroyer or Sherman holding a key crossroads and receiving a handful of HVAP rounds could blunt a German counterstroke by choosing decisive targets. Commanders later noted the psychological benefit in knowing there were rounds that could stop heavy tanks. Operationally, this meant the round's true contribution was intermittent but instrumental. A handful of penetrations could preserve bridgeheads, buy a day of maneuver, or blunt a counterattack's momentum. Those limited, verifiable impacts, not a wholesale revolution overnight, are the HVAP's real legacy in 1944-45 armored warfare.
For U.S. gunners, HVAP required new habits. Standard APC-BC rounds had predictable ballistic arcs. HVAP, with its much higher velocity, flew flatter and struck sooner. Veteran gunners recalled needing only slight elevation changes to hit targets that previously demanded careful range finding. Crews trained themselves to switch ammunition quickly. APC-BC for general engagements, HVAP reserved for heavy armor or ambush opportunities. But the scarcity meant every shot was a decision. After-action reports often contain margin notes like saved HVAP until confirmation of heavy tank, fired 1 HVAP at 600 yards, good penetration, or no HVAP available, flanked instead. The round did not replace tactics, it sharpened them.
One documented encounter near the German border in late 1944 illustrates how HVAP could alter a standoff. A Sherman 76mm supporting infantry spotted a Panther pulling from a hedgerow, angling for a hull-down position. At that distance, roughly 600-700 yards, older AP could fail against the Panther's glacis. The Sherman commander ordered 1 HVAP loaded. The gunner, already tracking the turret face rather than the hull, fired the moment the Panther turned. The tungsten-cored punched through the mantlet and disabled the gun. German infantry scattered. The Panther was abandoned intact except for the entry hole. Reports stressed it wasn't magic. It was the combination of angle, distance, and a penetrator dense enough to make the hit count. One round, properly placed, prevented a drawn-out fight.
Tank destroyer battalions felt the impact of HVAP more consistently than regular tank units because their ammunition priority was higher. M18 Hellcats, lightweight and fast, relied on speed and gun performance rather than armor. HVAP amplified the Hellcat's strengths. Crews reported newfound ability to take frontal shots they previously avoided. A Hellcat could accelerate into a firing position, loose a single HVAP round, and withdraw before German guns traversed. But TD commanders emphasized restraint. HVAP was not to be wasted on half-tracks or soft targets. Unit logs include careful accounting. 7 HVAP expended, 4 effective hits, 2 incomplete penetrations, 1 wide. For TD crews, HVAP wasn't just a tool, it was a precious asset that reshaped their confidence under fire. German armored crews eventually identified the distinctive results of HVAP hits: narrow, clean penetration holes without the usual spalling from standard APC-BC. Some Panzer commanders described these strikes as unusual, needle-like, or punches without explosion. While German APCR had existed earlier, their dwindling tungsten supply meant few German units could return fire with equivalent ammunition. This imbalance generated rumors. Some tankers insisted the Americans had developed a new high-temperature shell. Others speculated it was an explosive shape charge variant, misreading the smooth penetration. With scarce resources and mountain losses, psychological strain amplified technical misunderstanding. What the Germans feared was not sorcery, it was physics they lacked the material to counter.
As more reports arrived from the front, American battalion and regimental commanders began adjusting operational plans. When HVAP was present, commanders designated specific platoons as heavy tank counters, assigning them to watch intersections, bridge approaches, or forest gaps that German armor might exploit. In some sectors, HVAP-equipped vehicles were placed behind infantry units as mobile fire brigades to respond to sudden Panther or Tiger sightings. The key change wasn't aggression, it was flexibility. For the first time, U.S. forces had a small but reliable method to threaten German heavy armor from the front. This altered German risk calculus. Pushing boldly into prepared American lines became far more dangerous once HVAP was in the equation. Despite wartime exaggerations, the core reason HVAP frightened German crews was simple. Tungsten carbide is astonishingly dense and rigid. When launched at very high velocity, its energy didn't dissipate across a broad impact surface. It concentrated into a narrow point. Upon penetrating, the core often stayed intact long enough to ricochet inside the turret or crew compartment, causing deadly spall and disabling internal systems. German armor designs optimized against standard steel penetrators suddenly found themselves vulnerable in angles previously considered safe. The result wasn't melting, it was hyper-focusing of force. To a crew inside a tank, the difference was academic. The outcome was catastrophic, and the uncertainty bred fear faster than the shell itself. For American crews, even a tiny stock of HVAP rounds created a psychological cushion. Gunner manuals and unit briefings began referencing the round by name, acknowledging its tactical significance. Crews who had once dreaded meeting Tigers frontally now believed they at least had a fighting chance if they conserved their best ammunition and chose the moment. On the German side, morale fluctuated sharply when HVAP sightings were confirmed. A single clean penetration on a Panther could provoke sweeping rumors across a company or battalion. Veteran Panzer officers stressed that the real enemy was uncertainty, not knowing which American vehicle carried HVAP, how many rounds it had, or whether the next frontal hit might be the one that mattered most. After-action and interrogation reports collected in late 1944 and early 1945 give historians a clearer picture than wartime rumor. Allied intelligence and interrogation transcripts record German tank crews' astonishment at occasional needle holes and describe the shock when a supposedly invulnerable tank suddenly became a burnt-out husk. U.S. Ordnance officers annotated these reports alongside ballistic tests, creating cross-validated evidence that the M93/T4 HVAP rounds produced penetrations beyond older munitions. Importantly, investigators separated anecdote from documentary fact. Names, unit designations, dates, and range estimates were logged so later analysts could match claims to known engagements. These records are the backbone of any responsible documentary claim. In a documented crossroads defense in autumn 1944, an American company held a choke point against repeated German armor probes.
They had been resupplied overnight with a small cache of HVAP rounds concentrated in 2 tank destroyers. When the German assault came, those TDs emplaced hull down and waited. 2 well-placed HVAP hits on leading Panthers disrupted the German formation. The shock and loss of momentum forced the attackers to withdraw. Unit logs emphasize that the outcome owed as much to pre-planning, positioning, and conservation of rounds as to the penetrator itself. The case neatly demonstrates HVAP's tactical value when logistics and doctrine aligned.
Ballistic reality tempered expectations. HVAP produced complete penetrations, partial penetrations, and sometimes shatter depending on range, obliquity, or quality of the target plate. Test reports and combat notes show that at long ranges or extreme obliquity, the core could yaw or break, reducing effectiveness. Crews learned to aim for mantlets, turret faces, or thinner hull plates when possible. Consequently, training shifted toward identifying vulnerable geometry rather than assuming immunity. This nuance undercut simplistic frontline myths and taught soldiers to combine technical knowledge with battlefield savvy to maximize a limited resources effect.
Tungsten shortages were not a small footnote. They were the structural limit on HVAP's wartime impact. Allied procurement sources had to secure ore, refine carbide cores, and then prioritize shipments to the front. That supply chain, bounded by shipping space, competing needs for other munitions, and strategic resource allocation, meant HVAP could never be distributed in mass. Ordnance memos from late 1944 repeatedly flagged tungsten as a constraint and recommended strict issue controls. In essence, the technology existed early. Industrial and resource realities governed its reach. This logistical truth explains why the round remained a critical, intermittent advantage rather than an immediate revolution across all armored units.
Facing this new threat, German crews and engineers tried tactical and material responses. Where tungsten cores were unavailable in adequate numbers, crews emphasized mobility, camouflage, and dispersed formations to deny precise shots. Some units improvised add-on armor, angled approaches, and stronger reconnaissance screens to avoid exposed frontal engagements. Technical solutions, thicker faces or modified armor angles, took time and were often impractical under production strain. The German response was therefore predominantly tactical: avoid the environments HVAP favored, and deny enemy gunners the measured ranges needed for effective hits. Those adaptations reduced some losses, but could not negate the physics when HVAP was well employed. Decades later, veterans on both sides remembered HVAP in different register. American gunners spoke of the rare saved engagements, the 1 or 2 rounds that mattered in a day's fighting. German Panzer veterans recounted nights when a previously secure position suddenly seemed fragile. Oral histories show a common theme. HVAP was not a daily certainty, but a remembered edge, the sort of advantage that could tilt a micro-battle and ripple into operational consequence. Historians treat these memories carefully, cross-checking them with unit logs, after-action reports, and ordnance records. Where overlaps appear, the testimonies become powerful corroboration of documented effects.
HVAP's legacy is a study in proportion. Technically, tungsten-cored high-velocity penetrators foreshadowed post-war developments. They demonstrated the power of dense, hard materials at high speed and influenced later armor penetrator design. Operationally, HVAP provided targeted, decisive advantages in specific engagements and shifted tactical doctrines where available. But strategically, the round's scarcity and logistical constraints meant it could not on its own overturn armored warfare's larger balance. The real lesson is double. Material science matters, and so does the capacity to turn that science into sustained, distributable power, a lesson armies would take into the Cold War era. The nickname, the witch's shot, captured frontline emotion more than technical truth. The M93 HVAP did not melt armor or conjure miracles. It applied focused kinetic energy where older rounds could not, and when logistics permitted, it solved otherwise insoluble tactical problems. Its story is one of invention constrained by resource reality. Rare cores, careful issue, and disciplined use turned a laboratory advantage into battlefield utility. For wartime crews, that utility sometimes felt like fate. For historians, it is a precise example of how metallurgy, ballistics, and supply together shape the outcomes of combat. The witch's power was physics, and the wartime struggle to harness it tells a clear story about technology in total war.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe to our channel for more.